Bore da a croeso i'n Symposium Digartrefedd. Good morning and welcome to our Homelessness Symposium. It's fantastic to have over 100 people registered for today's event, and I can't wait to hear from our fantastic lineup of speakers. It has been 2 years since our last Homelessness Symposium, and it's difficult to remember what things were like before this pandemic. As a member of the Homelessness Action Group, at the time we were developing our proposals for ministers, but we had no idea what would be around the corner. Since then, we've seen an extraordinary response to homelessness in Wales, and it's important to yet again pay tribute to the staff who have been at the forefront of this response, continuing to deliver support when many other services stopped. I'm in no doubt that people have not only transformed lives, but saved lives during this pandemic, and we remain forever grateful for your efforts. Leadership has also been critical, from the funding allocated to supporting these efforts to the development of longer-term solutions. The Homelessness Action Group set out a roadmap to ending homelessness in Wales, and the new Welsh Government has restated its commitment to delivering this ambition, both in the programme for government and in the recent cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru. Today's event provides an opportunity to reflect on the situation in Wales, with the Welsh Government kicking us off with a presentation about the recently published Ending Homelessness Action Plan and the Race Equality Action Plan. That will be followed by an exclusive session with Crisis about their new homelessness monitor for Wales, with expert researchers who have examined the data and analysed what we need to do to tackle homelessness in Wales. This afternoon, we'll see a screening of the Groundswell film Clarissa and talk to Anthony Vaughan about the themes of trauma, trust and access to healthcare. We'll then expand our focus across Great Britain, hearing from the Centre for Homelessness Impact about their work to support local authorities across GB to reduce homelessness, before we then go global, hearing from the Institute of Global Homelessness based in Chicago about their work with cities across the world to tackle homelessness. I hope you find today interesting and informative, and although we're not in the same room today, we're keen for you to participate, and we encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A panel throughout today's event. I can see a number of you have already wished us good morning to you all, and please do submit questions in the Q&A next to the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Absolutely delighted to introduce Sarah Rhodes, who is head of the homelessness team in Welsh Government. Really grateful, Sarah, for you making time to be with us today. I know how busy you are managing the Welsh Government's response to homelessness, but I think it's really important that we share with attendees today the Welsh Government's vision for ending homelessness in Wales, and about the recently published Homelessness Action Plan. So please take it away, Sarah, and welcome to the conference.
Yeah, thanks very much, Katie. Good morning, all. I normally start by saying lovely to see you all, and I really wish I could actually see you all, but I know you're all out there, and it's really lovely to be here and setting out what we're doing from Welsh Government perspective, and the view in terms of ending homelessness. It's quite daunting to be going first, because that's quite a day of activity coming up ahead. So it sounds really interesting. So thanks for the invite, Katie. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to be talking to you about Welsh Government's Ending Homelessness Action Plan, and giving you a bit of context in terms of where that's come from. For those of you who suggested that people don't watch plenary sessions live, but for those of you who didn't see the Minister speaking in plenary last week, I'll just be reflecting on some of the things that the Minister set out, and really emphasising the priority that the government places on ending homelessness in Wales. So if I could, I've got some slides to run through, so fabulous, thank you. If you can move to the next slide, that would be grand. So, and I should say, for you, those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Rhodes, and as Peter said, I head the homelessness team in Welsh Government. So just to give you a bit of context in terms of where the action plan has come from, and I won't spend too long on this, because hopefully all of you are quite familiar with the context. Back in 2019, pre-pandemic, if anyone can remember that far ago, feels like decades ago, Welsh Government published our Ending Homelessness Strategy, and that was a very high-level short document that set out our ambition for ending homelessness in Wales, and it was quite an important document in terms of, it was the first time that we talked in terms of ending homelessness. Previous to that, Government had talked about tackling homelessness, preventing homelessness, addressing homelessness, but never in terms of ending it. So it was a significant shift and real change in terms of aspiration. And it set out the very clear policy principles within that, based around, when we talk about ending homelessness, we're talking about making it rare, brief and repeated, and that was set out in the strategy. And the policy principles were around early intervention, that they were the most effective and most cost-effective solutions, and should always be the interventions of first choice. Talked about homelessness being a public service matter, not simply a housing matter. Talked about individuals, the importance of individuals being at the centre of services, and that services should be delivered in a trauma-informed manner. It talked about the legislation being the last line of defence, not the first. There is the safety net. It talked about the importance of working in a co-productive manner, and I think that that has been absolutely apparent throughout the pandemic. And it also really, really importantly talked about the importance of people with lived experience being at the absolute centre of everything we do and informing everything at all layers of what we do. So in taking forward the strategy, we commissioned a homelessness action group to answer a series of questions in terms of how do we actually make that aspiration of ending homelessness in Wales a reality in practice. And they produced a series of reports. They worked over a 9-month period. The last report was slightly delayed because of the pandemic. But those reports produced a series of recommendations, and it's those recommendations and the underpinning strategy behind those that have led to the Ending Homelessness Action Plan. I'm really grateful for the work of the action group, because I think they did a lot of work in engaging the sector, engaging those with experience, engaging service providers. So they were really evidence-based and informed reports. And whilst the pandemic has changed some of the context in which we're working, it hasn't changed the fundamentals of what we need to do to end homelessness in Wales. So that group has reported now, but it's absolutely vital in terms of informing the work as we move forward. Next slide, please. So that helped us, as I say, to produce the Ending Homelessness Action Plan, which was published, I want to say last Tuesday, but maybe it was the Tuesday before, I can't remember where we are, on the 30th of November. And the Minister made a statement in plenary on the same day. And if you didn't get an opportunity to see it, I would, if you've got a spare 10 minutes, and I know that who's got a spare 10 minutes these days, but it really, really is worth watching it, because I think it's really important to see the level of commitment that the Minister and this government has got in terms of ending homelessness, and also to hear the Minister thank the sector for all the work that you've done. So you'll be aware that the importance and priority of this is set out in the programme for government. And as Katie's just said, it's absolutely reflected in the cooperation agreement between the government and Plaid Cymru as well. So absolutely front and centre in terms of the government's priorities. And what the Minister set out in her oral statement last week was really what's been achieved through the pandemic has been a real flipping of what has been centuries of acceptance and tolerance of a certain level of homelessness. And the work that you have all done has absolutely flipped that premise on its head. And we're in a position now where we are really, really clear, and the Minister is really, really clear, any homelessness is completely intolerable, and we are absolutely committed to ending it in Wales. And the Homelessness Action Plan sets out how we're going to do that, and it's set out in terms of the concept of rare, brief and repeated. And I think it's important to sort of unpack that a little bit. So when we talk about rare, we're talking about prevention. It's absolutely, and that needs to be the focus of all our activity. It's about, oh sorry, can you not hear me? I'm just getting a little message. I'll come a little bit closer. Is that better? Is that better? Fabulous. I'm not known for being a quiet one, so thank you. So when we're talking about it being rare, we're talking about prevention. We're talking about making sure that in the majority of cases, we want to be in a position where homelessness is prevented so that it becomes a rarity. So the Minister set out last week in the oral statement that that's about ensuring we address the core structural causes of poverty and inequality. It's about ensuring that there is the availability of universal prevention and targeted prevention measures. It's about ensuring that we effectively respond to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And all of that absolutely is dependent on a cross-government, cross-public service response. And that is absolutely reflected in the action plan. So we've necessarily, through the pandemic, obviously been focused on an emergency response, but that doesn't mean we've forgotten about prevention. So moving forward, the emphasis is very much on preventative activities. When we talk about briefing and repeated, what we're talking about is the transformation agenda that we're taking forward. So brief is about making sure that when we get to a point where, in those rare instances, people do become homeless, we quickly support them back into appropriate permanent homes. So that's about rapid rehousing. And we know that to move to a position of rapid rehousing, that is a long-scale transformation. We know it's not going to happen overnight, and there are loads of different measures that we need to take to get to that position. But we have started on that journey, and it's important that we get there as quickly as we possibly can. And when we talk about unrepeated, it's about making sure that we have the right homes in the right places for the right people. Ending homelessness isn't simply about putting somebody in a home. It's got to be the right home. It's got to be in the right place with the right level of support for that individual to succeed and thrive. So those two aspects of briefing and repeated are absolutely about our transformation agenda. And we set out in the action plan that it will involve legislative reform, and we're looking to publish a green paper sometime next year, setting out the aspects that we need to take forward in terms of that legislative reform. And the Minister was really, really clear in her oral statement that this isn't just about homelessness teams. We expect housing planners, housing development teams, they need to have a sense of urgency. It's really, really important that we address the needs of diverse communities, that we address the needs of people experiencing homelessness. Because of the actions taken through this pandemic, we've got a much better understanding of the true level of homelessness in Wales. So it's vital that is fed into that planning process, informs our local housing market assessments and the prospectuses, which inform the house building, social house building programmes in areas. So it's not just about homelessness. Oh, I can see somebody's still having difficulty hearing me. Is that across the board? Can I just check? What's wrong with my microphone? Sorry. I'll try. I'm wary of coming too close to the camera. You don't need me zoomed in that much. Is that any better?
Yeah, I think that sounds better. Thank you, Sarah.
All right, sorry about that. I'll try and raise my voice a bit as well. Apologies. That was quite difficult. I'll try and speak up. So, apologies if I sound like I'm shouting at you. I really am not. So it's about reflecting the diverse needs of communities. We better understand now the true level of homelessness in Wales. So it's about ensuring that the local housing market assessments, the prospectuses really reflect that. So it's not simply about homelessness teams, housing support teams. It's got to be about all teams across local authorities working together, about the whole of the public sector working together to end homelessness. And again, that's very much reflected in the action plan. Next slide, please. So the Minister's been really, really clear. We're not going back. As I said, she set up in her oral statement, we really have flipped that premise on their head. We really said, homelessness is not tolerable. We won't tolerate any level of homelessness. And we want to make sure that people are supported to ensure they've got access to temporary homes in the short term, but move into a system of rapid housing. And I think it's really, really important to reflect on the pandemic response. And I just echo what Katie said. The response across the housing sector has been absolutely phenomenal. And I just want to, if you didn't hear what the Minister said last week, she did, she took the time to thank everybody and the opportunity to thank everybody. And she said, you know, you transformed lives, you offer hope, and you've undoubtedly saved many lives through the pandemic. And that's absolutely backed up by the evidence. I'm not sure if you will be aware that the Office of National Statistics published its annual data on the number of deaths of people experiencing homelessness. And in Wales for last year, for 2020, it was 22. Now, obviously, that is 22 too many. But that number was down from 33 from the year before. And given that we are in a pandemic situation, given the numbers of people who would be included in that count now because of the numbers we've got in temporary accommodation, and the public and the health inequalities faced by those individuals and the health vulnerabilities that many will have, you know, that is unbelievable that the numbers have actually fallen in that situation, and it's absolutely down to the response that you have all taken and the work that you have done. You know, Wales has got 50% lower, excuse me, it's 50% lower than any region of England, and that's absolutely because of the all-in approach that we've taken and the work that you have done. So you should all be absolutely rightly proud. You know, it's when Katie says, you know, you've undoubtedly saved lives, it is absolutely backed up by the evidence. And it's really important, you know, the data that we get through now from local authorities in terms of the monthly management information that gives us an idea of the number of people sleeping left, the number of people in temporary accommodation. It's a really rich data set that helps to better understand the true level and scale of homelessness, who it impacts on, and the measures that we need to take moving forward. And I think, you know, the Ending Homelessness Action Plan is, whilst the initial pandemic response has been our emergency response and continues to be the emergency response because we're still in a pandemic situation, the Ending Homelessness Action Plan gives us that strategic overview now in terms of moving forward in a more strategic manner. Next slide, please. And I think it's really important to say, and the Minister did say, you know, we do not underestimate the scale of the challenge. You know, we absolutely recognise the pressure on services, you know, the volume of people that are currently in temporary accommodation, the number of people who continue to present in need of temporary accommodation, the pressure that is on household budgets. You know, now that we've got the potential of further restrictions with the Omicron variant, it's, you know, we don't underestimate the continued pressure on services. And the Minister was very, very clear in her statement that she recognises the pressure on services, and that's why, precisely why, we had an increase of £40 million in the housing support budget this year, you know, absolutely in recognition of the level of previously unmet needs that's been identified through the pandemic. It's absolutely why the record 250 million is being put into the social housing grant this year, absolutely in recognition. And we are, whilst obviously the budget for next year will be out on the 20th of December, and I can't say anything about the budget for next year, you know, we absolutely understand the challenges faced, the scale of the challenge, and be feeding that into the internal processes that go on, and the Minister is very aware of that as well. And I think, you know, the other thing that I would say, and the other thing that's recognised in the action plan, is the importance of the workforce. And there's a specific action in the action plan around the workforce, absolutely in recognition that we need to ensure that we have a workforce that is resilient and recognised for the work that it does. And I think, you know, and the work that you do, and I think that's been absolutely apparent through the pandemic. And I'm sure you will all be aware of the work that Come Up and Me in particular have been doing in terms of making sure that the sector is recognised and acknowledged in the various disciplines that have been in operation throughout the pandemic. And that's, you know, and that absolutely is something that we need to work on and build on and is recognised in the action plan. And we've got a task and finish group specifically working on that, being led chaired by Claire Beggin, And I know Katie's on the task of ministry, and we've got representatives from across local authorities as well. It's a really, really important strand of work that we're taking forward as a matter of urgency. Next slide, please. So as I said, the action plan also extends beyond housing. You know, it does recognise the cross-government commitment to work across departmental boundaries. You know, as you all know, it's relevant to health, social services, education, criminal justice, community safety, and actually the pandemic has really, really shown the value and importance of partnership working, of multi-agency working, and I think it's really strengthened relationships, and it's vital that we don't fall back and lose some of that momentum that we've gained through the pandemic on the multi-agency working front. And we're certainly within Welsh Government, we've got an internal cross-governmental board established to ensure that we've got that ownership and buy-in to taking this forward on a cross-governmental basis. And you will be aware, or you may be aware, that we've got a national advisory board which sits external to Welsh Government and advises in and will help us oversee and take forward the action plan. And that again includes representation from across sectors, and very, very much in recognition of the importance of working in a partnership way to take this forward. Next slide, please. So the last slide on this aspect that I want to say is, this is a living document. You know, we don't want this to be a document that we publish and it just sits on the shelf. There's a lot of work and activity ongoing to take it forward. I've already mentioned the task and finish group around workforce. We've also got task and finish group set up around the outcomes framework work, which I'm sure a number of you will be involved in, and also on rapidly housing, which again, I'm sure a number of you were involved in as well. And we're looking to establish a specific group around health and housing as well. Now, the principles behind the action plan are constant. You know, the fundamentals of what we need to end homelessness remain the same. But the flexibility and the living sort of element of the plan is very much in the actions, because things will evolve. We'll need to add in new actions, actions will move on, and we're committed to keeping the document updated to ensure that there's transparency in terms of how we're taking things forward, and also that we report against progress and ensure that we're very, very clear on where things are developing and how things are moving forward. So we'll be publishing the tables at the end of the action plan, republishing them on an annual basis so that the plan is constantly updated. So that's a very quick run through. I'm now going to hand over to Amelia John, who is the Deputy Director of Housing Policy in Welsh Government. So my team sits within Amelia's directorate, and Amelia is going to talk to you about the Race Equality Action Plan, and which is another plan of the Welsh Government. But I would just say that, you know, equality and diversity and the importance of all of that wider agenda as well is very much reflected in the Ending Homelessness Action Plan as well. So I'll hand over to you now. Thanks, Amelia.
Diolch yn fawr, Sarah and Bore Pawb. Thanks ever so much to Katie and Cymorth for inviting both of us here this morning. I'm really pleased to be talking about the Race Equality Action Plan, because equalities and human rights are absolutely fundamental to work around ending homelessness, as is obviously access to decent, affordable and appropriate housing. So yeah, really, really pleased. Thank you very much indeed. Let me see if I can move to the next slide. I can, so that's great. So what we're doing in terms of the 2 seconds, I'm having problems moving on my screen, but that's fine. What we're doing around the action plan is absolutely underpinned by tackling racism proactively and promoting race equality. And that means taking a really proactive approach. So not waiting for examples to arise, but actually, I'm sorry, I'm having a slight problem with the slides here, and I've had a message. I'm going to hand back to Cymorth to control the slides for me. So Great, thank you. So yes, tackling racism is absolutely fundamental to what we're doing, promoting race equality and doing that in a proactive way. We have to acknowledge that previous approaches have not necessarily worked. So in preparing for the Race Equality Action Plan, what we looked at was back to the Black and Ethnic Minority Housing Plan back in 2002. And I don't know if many of you will remember that plan, but it was really sobering to have a look at it again, because what we found that actually was so many of the same issues were alive then, almost 20 years ago, as now. So although race equality has been an absolute priority, ministerial priority, from the inception of the Welsh government, the reality is we were talking in that plan about the same things that we're talking about now. So we were talking about a lack of culturally appropriate housing, for example. We were talking about overcrowding for a disproportionate number of ethnic minority people, a lack of larger homes, racism and discrimination in some services, the need to challenge that, the need to have training available for all staff, that sense that we had to reach out and engage with ethnic minority communities, and also critically data gaps. And I think that's a really interesting one, because I think if we'd filled some of those data gaps way back in 2002, we'd be in a much better position now. And I guess I was reflecting on, we've had the public sector equality duty now since 2011, and that requires all public bodies to collect data, but we're still so far away from where we need to be. And that data is absolutely critical. That's true, obviously, in terms of ending homelessness as well, in tracking progress, in knowing where the gaps are. So I think that's really, really important, and that's going to be a priority for us. We obviously, more recently, have had the really tragic events with the brutal murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and that has really focused attention on the level of racism and discrimination within society. And Welsh Government has responded to that, knowing that we need to step up to the plate along with all of our partner organisations. And I guess the other thing that has really shone a light on the deep inequalities is COVID-19. And the First Minister set up a socioeconomic subgroup, a Black and Asian minority ethnic socioeconomic subgroup, to look at issues around COVID-19. And what they found and pointed to in the housing sphere, they talked about all sorts of spheres of life, but within the housing sphere, they talked particularly about poorer living conditions, particularly in the private rented sector, and overcrowding, and the difficulties that then brought around susceptibility to COVID-19. So that's given a sense of a real urgent and intensified need for action around inequality, and particularly for ethnic minority people. So let's try, I'll try and say next slide now, and we'll see if we can move on. Yes, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. That's brilliant. So in terms of our commitment around all of this, the draft plan was engaged on and consulted on, and that consultation ended in July of this year. And now we're in the process of refining what the plan looks like. But in terms of what the Race Equality Action Plan is about, I wanted to just sort of stress that it's about making meaningful change to people's lives. And what I mean by that is really tangible and visible change. So we want people to be able to see what it is we're trying to achieve with them, and to be able to hold us to account if we fail to do that. It's very much about anti-racism. So we had a whole debate in drafting the plan around the whole term non-racism, people being non-racist, and felt that didn't mean anything. What we need to be is proactively anti-racist. So we have to recognise that there's white privilege. We have to recognise unconscious and conscious bias, but also stereotyping and racism. So the plan is very, very much about fairness and equality across the board. It focuses on all sorts of different areas. You won't be surprised to hear education, health. We were really pleased that housing and accommodation was in there. That's obviously an absolute pillar of people's lives. And it also talks about promoting active citizenship to improve people's lives. And I think that's really important for all of us and for all of you, in terms of when we talk about active citizenship, we mean empowering people, we mean involving them, we don't just mean consulting them. And as Victoria Winkler said to me years ago about empowering communities and people, it's about giving power away, and that's absolutely what it involves, giving communities and people power to shape their own lives, to shape their communities, giving them voice and control. And that's a really, really important part of all this. in every area of their lives. So if we can go on to the next slide, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. So the ask was very much for an ambitious and radical plan. And I should say to you, we had a steering group set up to guide the work, but also with really, really strong challenge, which was sometimes uncomfortable, but that's good. We needed that, and that's really helped in drafting it. And Professor Emmanuel Ogbonna co-chaired that steering group with the permanent secretary. So the expectations are high. We went out and gave 25 community engagement grants to really reach out into communities so that those organisations could connect with people and gather their views. We each had community mentors around the areas of focus in the action plan. We had Aisha Ali, an urban planner, who's really helped and advised us. We involved ethnic minority groups and organisations. So this felt like a really, a real sort of co-created, or feels like a co-created plan and process. We had extensive engagement and deep dives on various areas. And again, that was really, really uncomfortable because we heard some experiences of really intense racism, discrimination, trauma, and that also is really informed. We're very grateful for people involving themselves in that because it's a really difficult thing to do, but that's really informed the action plan as well. I mean, I have to say to you that it's still, if it's quite a tome. I mean, I've got it here, it's 140 pages long. And I think the challenge for us is that we need to, it's still quite Welsh government speak and our terminology and language. And I think we need to really look at that. So if we can go on to the next slide, that'd be brilliant. So from all the evidence that we heard, we know that we need action right the way across housing and regen, but also across Welsh government. And this really links back to what Sarah said earlier, that all of these areas are so intermeshed, you can't separate them out. So we need to look at education, culture, economy, right the way across the board, and that has to be integrated and linked up with what we're doing in housing. But also, I think work with you in partnership, all of you are so important in this. We can't do it on our own. You're absolutely vital. Lots of you are doing loads around race equality and equality more generally. We need to learn from you, work with you if we're really going to push this forward. So it's got to be a really, truly collaborative effort, I think, on this. And I guess that's all about it. In terms of ending homelessness and this, it's the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act writ large. So it's about us trying to work towards achieving the wellbeing goals, but also really integrating those 5 ways of working. So long-term, preventative, collaborative, integrated, and critically involving people. And I think that sort of underpins everything we're trying to do. So we do have, and we must have, that's quite right, a vision, purposes and values going right to 2030. But just to say that one of the challenges to us was, well, we want to see change soon. We want to see change over the next 18 months. It's no good saying we'll have this change by 2030. That's great. We want longer term outcomes, but we want to see measurable change now and within the next 18 months. So there's a real focus on that next 18 months, which I think is absolutely right and proper. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Brilliant. So in terms of the draft goals, I should say to you that there are actions, timescales beneath each of these goals. But I'll go through them, not least because it's not too late to give us your views if you still want to around this. So if we go to the first goal, it's to significantly increase representation of ethnic minority people in senior leadership and at all levels of the workforce to reflect the diversity of the population in which they operate. So in terms of that, you will all know that representation is absolutely key at every level, and all the research shows that you will not get culture change with an organisation unless there's that diversity, and that's obviously ethnic minority people and people with other protected characteristics as well. The research also shows that why wouldn't you do this? Because the diversity of people and thought makes for much better decision making, makes for much better organisations. So we think that representation is a really, really key part of driving the cultural change and making the change that we need to see. So the second goal is to ensure housing and accommodation standards, provision and services advance race equality, embed anti-racism, equality and human rights, and meet the needs of different and diverse ethnic minority people. I mean, you'll recognise this as our partners right the way across the board. We've got to have anti-racism embedded within all aspects of service provision and standards. That's writ large, as Sarah's already said, in the Ending Homelessness Action Plan. We absolutely recognise the need to embed that approach around equality and diversity. And I should say, and human rights, that as well as the steering group in all of this, our partners have helped inform all of these goals around housing and accommodation. So Comorth have been fantastic, but lots of other partner organisations, TIPAB, CHC, WLGA and more. So they've really helped inform the goals and continue to, in terms of as we refine them. The third area is, the third goal is to ensure the private rented sector advances equality and embeds anti-racism and meets the needs of ethnic minority people. And the reason that's specifically in there is because of the evidence that we heard from so many ethnic minority organisations. And what they said, and we know this from the data, albeit that it's not as good as we want it to be, is that a disproportionately high number of ethnic minority people live in the private rented sector. The private rented sector tends to be of a poorer quality and lower standards. And therefore, in terms of looking at poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage, we needed to specifically focus on private rented sector. We've taken that on board, which is why we've got the goal around that. And I have to say, we're taking action across the private rented sector to try to drive up standards within it. So thank you. Next slide, please. So the fourth goal is around ensuring accessible engagement with ethnic minority people across Wales. So Welsh Government policies reflect the diversity of ethnic minority people's needs and priorities, and ethnic minority people have voice and influence. And I've already touched on this, and I think this is really close to the heart of Comorth and other organisations, as well as that sense of lived experience. We can't develop policy, and it's a policy that then impacts on all of you as well as citizens in Wales. We can't develop that policy unless we have the voices of people, the lived experience to inform it. You know, it's no good us just developing policy and chucking it over the wall and seeing how it lands. It needs to be done in a much more iterative and integrated way. I think equality impact assessment is a big part of that, and that, I think the cultural shift that's needed there is not about filling in a form, which I think sometimes people get fixated on. We do absolutely need an audit trail, but this is about an iterative approach where we're involving and engaging people in developing our policy in a way that means it's actually going to meet their needs. So that, what I would say is, I'm very happy to talk to anybody with your ideas around this, but having that accessible engagement, it's not easy to achieve. How do we do that effectively? People can become, organisations can feel taken for granted and very tired and overburdened by engagement and consultation. They absolutely need to believe that it's going to produce change, lead to change, not just then, it's not just a tick box exercise. So doing it meaningfully, I think, is challenging. And I mean, good to hear comments like Alex's. Talk to us about how you're doing it effectively, because we would want to do that, and also use other organisations as conduits to really get out into communities. The final goal, and we're liaising with our colleagues who lead on Gypsy and Traveller equality, is to recognise that safe, culturally appropriate accommodation is necessary for people to flourish in other parts of their lives, and to address the lack of site provision and poor quality of Gypsy and Traveller accommodation in Wales. We heard incredibly powerful testimony from Gypsies and Travellers who, about the daily experience of discrimination and racism that they face, as well as the very poor living conditions on sites, and feel really, really powerfully that we need a goal that specifically looks at the depth of that inequality and seeks to address it. So that that was incredibly sort of powerful testimony from them. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So we had a brilliant consultation. We had over 320 responses, and they came in, and I think this is something for us to learn for future consultation responses. Most of them were in writing, but they didn't have to be. People filmed themselves, recorded conversations. So that was great. And we had a real wealth of experience and expertise, some really moving testimony as well through the consultation responses. So that's all been amazingly helpful. I think we were really pleased, but I think, to be honest, this just reflects the fact that we spoke to other organisations about the housing and accommodation goals, that there's a real broad support for those goals. There's some gaps, and I'll go on to those in a moment, but generally speaking, there was a really broad support, so that was great. There was, and this has really resonated, I think, with us, a sense of that we need to more clearly identify the levers and drivers for change. So that there will be certain levers that we can use that will be more powerful than others, that will progress things more quickly than others, and that's what we need to focus on. I think that's absolutely right. So next slide, please. Great, thank you. So reflections, just as I move towards to finishing and then to Q&A. So the reflections on the responses that we had back. Well, we had, again, really strong sense from Gypsy and Traveller communities that they do not like the term housing and accommodation. So although in the plan, the draft plan, we make clear that we don't just mean bricks and mortar, we mean all homes, they feel that just the constant reference to housing excludes Gypsy and Traveller communities. And I think that then made us really reflect on the fact that actually homes is just so much better a term, because it's not just about housing, it's about a home that's rooted in a community where people feel valued, they feel respected, they feel safe. And that's what home means, not just a house or a flat or accommodation. Or whatever it may be, it's about having a home. So we will absolutely take that on board. That sense of real clarity around the actions and the measures, and that's partly so that all of you can hold us to account, and also because there are actions for many of the organisations that are in this virtual room that we can hold each other to account, I guess, so that there's absolutely clarity about that, and that people out there know what to expect and what progress they can expect to see. We did have a feedback that tackling poverty wasn't referenced strongly enough, and we're discussing with colleagues, because that's very much a cross-cutting area. So that goes right the way across Welsh Government and all areas in the Race Equality Action Plan. So we really need to look at that. It's obviously fundamental to ending homelessness as well. So we're talking with colleagues about how we make that much more sort of prominent. That intersectionality needs to be much stronger throughout and that's true right the way throughout the plan. So we had that as feedback on our section and our chapter, but everybody else did too. So that was that sense of that we all have multiple identities, that people may be an ethnic minority, disabled woman, for example, and have real strength in that identity, but also face multiple barriers. And that we just need to explore that more in terms of people's lived experience of discrimination, but also the strength that they have as well. There was a really strong feeling that we need to demand access to more, and by we I mean us, you, to more and improved data. That just needs to be an expectation that, and I talked about the 2002 housing plan, we just don't want to be here in another 20 years time. We need to get that data and improve it radically, and that includes around ending homelessness, of course. We need to understand the individual's experience as they move through, to understand better prevention, but also really reflect on people's protected characteristics and the particular barriers they may face. So data is absolutely key, and you can expect us and your colleagues and other organisations can expect us, where we're funding, to be asking for much better data. And then finally, to include refugees and those seeking asylum. We do include them within the Race Equality Action Plan in the housing section, the home section, but there was just a sense that we might want to strengthen that. And that's, again, something that we're working on with colleagues who lead on refugee and asylum seeking equality. Next slide, please. So yes, absolutely, we need action right the way across Welsh Government. I think, importantly, we need action with all of you. We can only do this all together, and I know that everybody in this room will have an absolute commitment to tackling racism, to anti-racism, that we need stronger governance and accountability. We're going to have a governance system set up, framework set up in Welsh Government, which continues with external stakeholders who I can really reassure you will absolutely keep not only advising us, but holding our feet to the fire on this to make sure there is progress, because expectations are quite rightly high. That we need to use our funding levers better, and I've touched on this already. So we need to be asking people for data, asking to make sure that the anti-racism absolutely embedded and that they're giving the right training, and challenging racism and indeed discrimination across the board. We need to look at the housing association regulator role. You may know that there will be a renewed framework for housing associations next year. There a lot of feedback that people wanted a stronger focus on equality and diversity, so they'll have an important role to play. And then finally, that point I've already made around we need greater engagement, voice and influence for ethnic minority communities. So if we move on to my final slide. So what we are now doing is that we're refining the outcomes and actions. We want to make sure they're concrete. We want to make sure they're easily understood by people. We will have a detailed plan because we need that to be able to follow through and make sure that we're making the progress that we say we're going to make, but we'll also have a summary front-facing document that's much more accessible for citizens rather than civil servants. And of course, we'll have accessible versions and children and young people's versions as well. So what we want to do is work with all of you. The final Race Equality Action Plan will be published in the spring of next year. So please do, as I say, we're already working with Comorth and other partners, but if you haven't been involved and you want to be involved, please let me know, because we're really keen for this to be a collaborative approach. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Amelia and Sarah. You got through a huge amount of detail in that last 40 minutes. So thank you very much. And it's great to see over 90 people in the audience here listening to those presentations. Please do submit your questions. We have a few already, but please do submit them using the Q&A part of the chat function. And just to remind you that in the handout section, we have the Ending Homelessness Action Plan documents, as well as the draft Race Equality Action Plan as well. So please do take a look at those in your own time. So first up, we have a question about join up in policy and silo working. So I think you touched on it, Sarah, but how important is it to see that join up between the sort of capital development side of housing supply and the homelessness policy? Because I think it's probably fair to say that those have operated at times in what has appeared isolation. And actually, if we're going to take rapid rehousing forward, I think it's really important that that supply of homes is absolutely in line with the ending homelessness policy. And I guess that probably needs to happen both at Welsh Government level and at a local level within local authorities. So, what have you been doing to kind of improve that coordination, and what would you like to see happen in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just check, because I fiddled with my settings, is that better?
Yeah, that's much clearer, thank you.
I should have done that earlier, I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely, Katie. And whoever asked that question, it's a really, it's a really good question. It's a really good point, and it's something that we've been working on, and I think it's been really highlighted through the pandemic. And we've put our hands up from a Welsh Government perspective that we haven't done it effectively enough in the past. There's been the social housing grant and the capital programme has been quite separate from the housing policy and the homelessness work, and it absolutely cannot be like that. And I think at a Welsh Government level we've made massive strides forward in terms of doing that genuine join up. And I think it's not just about recognising the links, it's actually doing that, working collaboratively, co-productively together. So, we've worked really closely with that team as they've been developing the new local housing market assessment to make sure that our considerations are absolutely fed into it and integral. They've also, and I think, as I say, the pandemic's really helped, because actually the phase 2 programme meant that that was a programme that we worked jointly on, and that team got a much better understanding of where we were coming from and the policy work that we were doing, and we got a better understanding of the work that they were doing, and it's really, really strengthened. So yeah, I think that helps absolutely. If we at a Welsh Government level are really, really clear that we are joining up and making the connections, and we expect that to happen at every level as well. But it's understandable if you all out there don't see us doing it at a Welsh Government level, then it makes it far more difficult. So we've absolutely got to set the example in terms of that. And I think we've made massive strides forward on that. We're not, I'll be honest, we're not there. It's not perfect, and we still need to do more to make sure that it is as joined up as we want. And I know, the timelines in terms of when certain plans, when certain needs assessments are done, when certain plans are required, it's not as aligned as it could be, and as smooth as it could be. So we're making the best of it at the moment. But I think, you know, as we move forward and as we're learning, and I think the feedback that we get from you all, you know, service providers, local authorities, RSLs, it really, really helps us to improve that as well. And we're really, really keen to support you all to help with the join up, you know, across local authorities, across RSLs and everything as well, because it is absolutely vital. And I know that, you know, homelessness teams can sometimes feel isolated in terms of, you know, having to deal with all these issues on their own, and absolutely that should not be the case. So I think we've made massive strides forward, but we've still got more progress to further to go.
And I think the other thing to say is that the oral statement, the minister's really clear. Her vision is so joined up, not just, I mean, across Welsh Government, but also across housing and regen. So she just doesn't see the different issues. And we're working really hard. Sarah, we had a meeting, didn't we, with Irish government officials yesterday, because their housing plan, if anyone wants to have a look, is just incredible and so joined up. So we're learning from them, and we're going to carry on that conversation with them, because yeah, that was really, really interesting.
Brilliant, thanks both. And yeah, because I guess we're seeing the pressures on local authority homelessness teams at the moment with the numbers in emergency accommodation, and it's just, you know, they're so acutely aware of the need for that housing supply that is truly affordable, not that fake affordable term that gets bandied about sometimes. We've had a couple of questions in about cross-government elements. So Tom has come in with, how will you ensure that the new homelessness outcomes framework is properly embedded across all Welsh Government departments and local authorities, and not just seen as Welsh Government housing responsibility? And the other question that we had was, you know, how are you going to encourage other public services to play their part when you know, many of them are under huge pressure? So if you could answer that would be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. So on the outcomes, and they're both linked really. So on the outcomes framework work, yeah, absolutely. It's I think it's about making sure that the high level outcomes that we've got are cross-governmental. They're not simply housing outcomes, because, you know, as we all know, it's by the time you get to homelessness services, you've already failed at some point along the way. You know, that should be the rarity, as I said earlier. So where I think the governance that I talked about earlier, in terms of we've got an internal strategic cross-government board, and it's, you know, it's about making sure that we're taking these things to that board as well, and getting that join up at a senior level within Welsh Government. And also, you know, we take things quite often to cabinet, so that we get cross-cabinet sign up to things as well. You know, this isn't just about our minister, you know, banging the drum. It's about all ministers recognising the impact and, you know, that their individual areas can play. So, and I think in terms of, yes, everybody is busy, you know, all services are absolutely up against it. You know, we've all got similar problems in terms of, you know, recruiting into the workforce, you know, pressure on services. They are very similar, but I think it's about making sure that we are clearly communicating and articulating to those other areas the benefit to their services that actually, you know, ending homelessness would have, reducing pressure. And, you know, it doesn't just reduce pressure on homelessness services, it will reduce pressure on A&E emissions, it would reduce pressure and wider health and social care services. So it's about understanding, you know, that wider perspective. Is about understanding that homelessness is not just about housing, and, you know, we've all got a role to play in that, I think, in terms of the conversations that we have with our colleagues, and the work that we do. So yeah, but certainly from a Welsh Government perspective, you know, we've got the governance structures internally to make sure that we're regularly having those conversations in both an informal and a formal manner, to make sure that we're, you know, we're holding our colleagues' feet to the fire as well then.
Definitely. And I guess, you know, the outcomes framework and the development of that will be another kind of form of accountability to making sure different sectors play their part. Amelia, on the Race Equality Action Plan, you know, you talked about representation being really important. And I guess particularly when we're talking about our sector, where building trusting relationships is often very challenging because people have been failed by the system so many times, and then when you bring the kind of racism element into it and that kind of institutional racism and the experiences, I think it shows the importance of, like, yes, let's increase sort of representation across government and across public bodies, but particularly within the kind of homelessness and housing support sector, that's particularly important, is it, that people can see themselves reflected in the workforce and in decision making?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, because it's fundamental to trust. And I should say, Welsh Government's got a long way to go on this, and we absolutely hold our hand up to that. We do not have representation within Welsh Government, and we need to make huge strides around that at all levels, particularly at senior levels. But you're absolutely right. And what that leads to actually is a lack of trust from some communities who can't see themselves reflected in Welsh Government, and as you say, within organisations, because people will feel, well, I have a lived experience that these organisations don't understand, I'm not reflected within it. It's also really challenging because if you get one or two people within an organisation, they can feel very isolated. So it's incredibly important to make sure the support structures are around people, so they feel listened to and empowered to take forward anti-racism and anti-discrimination within the organisation. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's fundamental to trust is that people can look and see themselves reflected in any organisation.
Yeah, and I think, providers have a responsibility to do all they can to employ a diverse workforce. And then I guess it's also looking to make sure that when commissioning, there are opportunities for diverse organisations who might have kind of specialisms or particularly good representation in certain communities to be able to be part of that commissioning environment and that service environment as well.
You're absolutely spot on there, and that's why the action plan's got to be so linked up, because this links to the foundational economy, it links to smaller companies, for example, that might be ethnic minority-led companies and organisations, because very often, particularly large public bodies, can be, go out and commission and end up going to a larger organisation that maybe can spend more time filling in the forms and making the application. And what we want is to be giving a really levelling the playing fields, that people have the opportunity from, and actually recognising that people from a local community and organisations will bring a strength that large organisations may well not. So, but that's where it's all got to link up. We can't just look at housing and homes. We need to be looking at economy, culture, education, everything in a really integrated way.
Definitely. Tom's come back in with another question. Please, can you consider how the data collection to underpin the homelessness outcomes could be simplified to ease pressure on support workers and could be collected in a trauma-informed way? Well, Tom, we're part of the kind of outcomes, HSG outcomes task and finish group. There's a task and finish group and then a sub-task and finish group that's looking at this, and that's absolutely something that certainly I've raised in those discussions about. We absolutely understand the importance of having data that evidences impacts, because it's quite timely. We want ministers to be able to fight for that funding around the cabinet table, but at the same time we don't want support workers to be spending more time filling in spreadsheets than they are delivering support, or for that data that they're collecting to be re-traumatizing people. So that's absolutely going to be part of the considerations. And the last meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago, there was a real sense of, let's not just tweak the existing framework, let's take a fresh look at this and take this opportunity to do something meaningful and different, but that makes that difference, but also doesn't pile the pressure on support workers. And just to say that we will be liaising with frontline workers through our Frontline Worker Wales network to make sure that those views are incorporated. Jan has asked, is there current equality data on people experiencing homelessness that we can access? So I'm not sure if there used to be within the statutory data that was collected. And I guess that's something for us to think about as we kind of set up the new data collection systems to make sure that we're able to do that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is very limited, and I think that's where we recognise that actually, there's a lot more that we need to do, and it is absolutely about getting that balance, I think, between as well, making sure, because we're really conscious that there are lots of different data requirements. There's the old kind of SP outcomes data that I know is still collected. There's the statutory homelessness data, there's the monthly collections, And where we want to get to is a position where we've integrated the grants and the funding. We want to be integrating the data so that actually we collect in one data set that gives us the entirety of the picture. As you say, Katie, tells us about delivery on the ground, to help inform policy decisions and things, and to know that we're getting the outcomes we need. But if we fundamentally need to ask ourselves some serious questions as well. If we're collecting data that's not telling us anything or not answering a question for us, then why are we collecting it? So there's a lot of work to do around the data, because it's to get us to a position where it's much more coherent. And I think it links well into the legislative reform that we're looking at as well, because obviously there'll be a statutory data aspect to that. So it's really, really important that we do it in a coherent manner.
Thanks, Sarah. And we're just getting to the end of the session, but I have one last question, briefly, if we could, that follows on from that last comment about the legislation. And you said in your presentation that we envisage a green paper in the spring. Are you able to kind of share any initial thoughts about the sort of things that green paper might look to kind of tackle within the legislative plans?
Yes. So I think I said next year, Katie. I don't think I was specific about the season. Just to be clear. Although I know civil service seasons, anybody who's worked with civil servants knows the seasons are very changeable. So what the green paper, what the action plan sets out is that it'll include consideration of priority need, intentionality, allocations, evictions, local connections, suitability, duties on public bodies, a rights-based approach, which is something we're trying to take through, everything that we do is about, making sure we're taking a rights-based approach. So there's a lot in there, which is why we're looking to green paper first, because this is about a whole system change, and it's really, really important we get it right. If you tinker with one bit, it has an impact elsewhere. So it's really, really important we get it right. And it's really, really important that we have as wide a range of views and involvement of as wide a range of people as possible. So, to all of you, there will be lots and lots of opportunities to get involved in that, because we haven't got all the answers, and we're really, really keen to draw on all your experience and expertise to help us get the next iteration of legislation. The first one, they talk about the 2014 being groundbreaking. We want the next iteration of legislation to be, really setting the bar and setting Wales in a different sphere to everybody else.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Lots to look forward to getting stuck into at some point next year, non-specific season. So thank you both so much. I think that was really interesting and informative. As I said, we've got over 90 people still here, so I'm guessing they found it really interesting as well. And I think really helpful to hear your perspective on what we're trying to achieve here in Wales. So we're going to end the session now. Thank you both so much for taking time out to be here today. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. Those were fantastic questions. We have about 11 minutes until the next section. So please do run off, grab yourselves a coffee and come back at 10:45 for our State of the Nation Homelessness Monitor for Wales session, which is an exclusive session hearing from the lead researchers who have produced the Homelessness Monitor for Wales. So lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for coming along, and we'll see you in the next section. Thanks again, Amelia and Sarah, for your time this morning. Thank you.